20 years of marriage, a sprawling Chicago estate, and a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. Richard threw it all away the day he moved his 24-year-old secretary into his marital bed. He thought he was trading up, tossing his quiet, loyal wife aside with a modest settlement. He felt like a king, an untouchable titan of industry. Right up until the morning he tried to buy his new mistress a $400,000 Ferrari, only to hear two soul-crushing words from the dealership. Card declined. Richard Sullivan was a man who believed his own press clippings. At 48, he was the charismatic CEO of Sullivan Freight and Logistics, a company that dominated the Midwest's shipping lanes. He wore bespoke Italian suits, kept his silver-flecked hair immaculately styled, and walked into boardrooms with the swagger of a man who had built the world from scratch. But Richard hadn't built the world from scratch. He had built it with Margaret. Margaret, Maggie to her friends, was the quiet, brilliant architect behind the Sullivan Empire. 22 years ago, when they were living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in South Side Chicago, it was Maggie who drafted the business plans. It was Maggie who designed the proprietary routing software that eventually made their trucks 30% more efficient than the competition. Richard was the salesman. He had the golden tongue that could charm investors and secure massive vendor contracts. But Maggie was the engine. She handled the finances, the legal structures, the corporate tax loopholes, and the grueling late-night audits. As the years passed and the millions piled up, a subtle shift occurred. The company moved from a dusty warehouse office to a gleaming glass tower in the Loop. Richard became the face of the brand, appearing on the covers of local business magazines and giving keynote speeches. Maggie, who loathed the spotlight and preferred the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly balanced ledger, happily stepped into the background. She stepped back so far, in fact, that Richard eventually forgot she was the one holding up the stage he stood on. Enter Chloe Jennings. Chloe was 24, ruthlessly ambitious, and possessed a manufactured beauty that turned heads in every room she entered. She was hired as an executive assistant, but it was clear from her first day that typing memos was not her end goal. She wore designer clothes she couldn't possibly afford on her salary, laughed a little too loudly at Richard's mediocre jokes, and constantly fed the beast of his ego. "You're a visionary, Richard," she would purr, leaning over his mahogany desk, strategically ensuring he caught a glimpse of her neckline. "The board doesn't understand how much of this company is purely your genius." Richard, suffering from the classic midlife delusion that his youth was slipping away, swallowed the bait whole. The affair began predictably. Late nights at the office turned into urgent business trips to Miami and Aspen. Richard believed he was the master of discretion. He set up a separate bank account, used burner phones, and thought he was leaving no trace. He severely underestimated the woman he married. Maggie didn't find out about the affair through a smudge of cheap lipstick on a collar or a lingering scent of Chanel No. 5. She found out because she was still the only person who truly understood the labyrinthine accounting software she had built 2 decades prior. It was a rainy Tuesday night. Maggie was sitting in her home office, sipping herbal tea, idly running a routine diagnostic on the company's back-end servers, a habit she kept purely for her own peace of mind. A ghost charge flickered on the screen. A phantom subsidiary account, buried under 3 layers of shell corporations designated for fleet maintenance, showed a sudden spike in expenditures. Curious, Maggie dug deeper. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the security firewalls she herself had designed. The fleet maintenance expenses weren't for diesel or tires. They were for a $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet from Cartier. a $4,500 nightly rate at the Ritz-Carlton in South Beach, a lease on a luxury condo in the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago. Maggie sat perfectly still as the digital paper trail painted a vivid, agonizing picture of her husband's betrayal. A lesser woman might have screamed, thrown plates, or immediately called a divorce lawyer to burn his life to the ground. She might have driven to the Gold Coast condo and dragged the 24-year-old secretary out by her blonde hair. But Maggie was not a creature of explosive emotion. She was a strategist. She looked at the screen, her heart fracturing into 1,000 icy pieces, and took a slow, deep breath. Richard wanted to play games with company money. He wanted to fund his second youth using the empire she had meticulously built. Fine, Maggie thought, a cold, hard resolve settling over her. Let him think he's won. Let him think he owns the board. The next morning, Maggie didn't mention the hotel receipts. She didn't ask about the Cartier bracelet. She simply kissed his cheek, straightened his tie, and told him to have a good day at work. Then she picked up her phone and scheduled a flight to Manhattan to meet with Simon Hayes, the most ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney on the eastern seaboard. 4 months later, Richard came home to their sprawling estate in Winnetka, poured himself a stiff glass of Macallan 18, and asked for a divorce. He stood by the marble fireplace, looking everywhere but at Maggie's eyes. He recited a speech that sounded suspiciously rehearsed. "We've grown apart, Maggie. The spark is gone. I need to live my truth, and it's not fair to either of us to keep pretending. I'll make sure you're taken care of course. I want this to be amicable." Maggie sat on the velvet sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had spent the last 4 months orchestrating a financial masterpiece, but in this moment, she needed to play the role Richard expected. The heartbroken, discarded, passive wife. She let a single tear roll down her cheek. "Is there someone else, Richard?" she whispered, her voice trembling perfectly. "No," Richard lied smoothly, not missing a beat. "It's just time." The divorce proceedings began a week later. Richard hired Jonathan Gable, a loud, aggressively expensive Chicago divorce attorney known for bullying spouses into submission. Richard's primary goal was to protect Sullivan Freight and Logistics. In his arrogant mind, the company was his baby. His name was on the building. He was the CEO. Maggie was just a former partner who hadn't set foot in the corporate office in 8 years. During the mediation sessions, Richard and Jonathan presented their offer. It was, in their eyes, incredibly generous. Maggie would get the Winnetka estate, the summer house in Nantucket, a lump sum of $5 million, and a tidy alimony of $40,000 a month. Considering the company was valued at nearly $90 million, it was a laughable insult. But Jonathan Gable slid the paperwork across the polished conference table with a smug grin. "This is a clean break, Margaret. Richard wants to ensure you are comfortable for the rest of your life. But the company, the corporate assets, the fleet, the intellectual property, that remains entirely with Richard. He built it, after all." Maggie's lawyer, Simon Hayes, sat quietly beside her. He was a small, unassuming man, with wire-rimmed glasses, entirely unimpressive to look at. He played the part of the overwhelmed local attorney perfectly. Maggie looked at the paperwork. Her hands shook, a masterful piece of acting. I just want this over with," she said softly, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I don't care about the trucks. I don't care about the business. Just let me keep my home." Richard felt a surge of relief, followed quickly by a wave of pity. Poor Maggie, he thought. She just doesn't have the stomach for the big leagues anymore. Simon Hayes cleared his throat. "We are prepared to accept the division of physical assets as proposed. However, for tax purposes, and to expedite the clean break my client so desperately needs, we have drafted an addendum regarding the release of all corporate ties. It simply states that Margaret relinquishes her voting rights in Sullivan Freight and Logistics, and in exchange Richard signs over the dormant holding company, Apex Holdings, to Margaret. It's an old shell corp. It holds zero liquid capital, just some old software patents from the late 90s. Jonathan Gable, eager to secure a massive win for his client and get out to the golf course, barely skimmed the addendum. He checked the financials of Apex Holdings on his iPad. Apex? Yeah, it's a ghost entity. Zero revenue. Valued at nothing. Fine by us. Richard didn't even read it. He was too busy texting Chloe under the table, promising her they would go ring shopping this weekend. He took the gold Mont Blanc pen and scrawled his signature across the documents, effectively severing his 22-year marriage. He didn't notice the brief, dangerous flash of triumph in Maggie's eyes. He didn't realize what he had just signed away. Richard had a massive blind spot. Because he was the face of the company, he assumed he was its soul. He had completely forgotten the corporate restructuring Maggie had done 15 years ago to shield them from a massive IRS audit. Sullivan Freight and Logistics didn't actually own its trucks. It didn't own the warehouses. And most importantly, it didn't own the proprietary routing algorithm that made the company profitable. All of those assets, the fleet, the real estate, the intellectual property, were technically owned by Apex Holdings. Sullivan Freight merely leased them from Apex at a heavily discounted rate. By signing over total, uncontested ownership of Apex Holdings to Maggie, Richard hadn't just given her a dormant shell company. He had given her the keys to his entire empire. But for the next 6 weeks, Richard lived in ignorant bliss. The divorce was finalized. He moved Chloe into the $4 million Gold Coast penthouse, a property he purchased using company funds, assuming his ultimate control over the board made him untouchable. Chloe immediately went to work spending his money. She completely redecorated the penthouse, demanding custom Italian furniture and imported marble. She threw lavish parties, introducing Richard to her circle of 20-something friends, parading him around like a wealthy prize. Richard felt young, vibrant, and invincible. He had successfully excised the boring part of his life and kept his fortune, or so he thought. It was a stunningly bright Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after the divorce was stamped by a judge. Richard and Chloe were at the exclusive Ferrari dealership in downtown Chicago. Chloe had been whining for a week about how her Range Rover felt too suburban, and she wanted something that matched her new status as the soon-to-be Mrs. Sullivan. She was currently draped over the hood of a sleek silver Ferrari Roma, posing while a salesperson nervously hovered nearby. "It's perfect, Ricky," Chloe cooed, blowing him a kiss. "I want it. Today." Richard smiled indulgently. "Wrap it up," he told the dealer, pulling out his heavy metal black card. "Put the tax and title on this as well." The dealer nodded eagerly and hurried into the glass-walled finance office. Richard poured himself an espresso from the complimentary machine, feeling like the master of the universe. He watched Chloe take a selfie with the car, already posting it to her thousands of followers. Life was perfect. 10 minutes later, the dealer returned. He looked pale. He wasn't holding the keys. "Mr. Sullivan," the dealer said, his voice dropping to an awkward whisper. "I'm sorry, but..." The card was declined. Richard scoffed, nearly spilling his espresso. "Declined? That's impossible." "It's an Amex Centurion. There is no limit. Run it again. Your machine is probably broken." "I did run it again, sir, and I called the merchant line. They said the account has been suspended." Richard's face flushed a deep, violent red. He snatched the card from the dealer's hand. "This is ridiculous. Give me a moment." He pulled out his phone and dialed his private wealth manager at Chase Bank. Chloe sauntered over, a pout forming on her glossy lips. "Ricky, what's taking so long? I want to drive it to lunch." "Just a technical glitch, babe." "Hold on," Richard muttered, pressing the phone to his ear. "Mr. Sullivan," the banker answered. His tone was noticeably devoid of its usual sycophantic warmth. "I was just about to call you. William, what the hell is going on? I'm trying to make a purchase and my card is declined. Fix it, now." "I can't do that, sir," William said, his voice tight. "Your personal accounts, as well as your executive discretionary accounts, have been frozen." Richard felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. "Frozen? By who? On what grounds?" "By a federal court order, sir. We received an emergency injunction an hour ago from a legal entity called Apex Holdings. They have filed a massive civil suit against you for corporate embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The court ordered an immediate freeze on all your liquid assets to prevent capital flight pending a forensic audit." "Apex Holdings?" Richard hissed, his brain struggling to process the words. "That's a dead shell company. My ex-wife owns that. She doesn't have the power to freeze my accounts." "Sir, I'm just reading the injunction. It appears Apex Holdings is claiming that you illegally funneled over $7 million of their licensing revenue into personal real estate, specifically a penthouse in the Gold Coast, and luxury goods." Richard hung up the phone, his hands shaking. The espresso in his stomach turned to acid. Chloe was tugging on his sleeve now. "Ricky, what's wrong? Are we getting the car or not?" "Shut up, Chloe," he snapped, the facade of the suave billionaire cracking instantly. She recoiled, staring at him in shock. Richard frantically dialed his chief financial officer, Thomas Wright. The phone rang 5 times before Thomas picked up. Background noise indicated absolute chaos. Phones ringing, people shouting. "Thomas, what the hell is happening?" Richard demanded, pacing the showroom floor. "Why is my ex-wife's shell company filing injunctions against me?" "Richard." Thomas's voice was hollow, the sound of a man watching a bomb go off. "Where are you?" "I'm at a damn car dealership. Tell me what is going on." "It's gone, Richard. It's all gone." "What is gone?" "The company, the infrastructure, everything." Thomas took a ragged breath. "At 9 a.m. this morning, we received a termination of lease notice from Apex Holdings. They revoked our licensing rights to the proprietary routing software. 10 minutes later, every single computer in the dispatch center locked us out. The screens just went black." Richard stopped pacing. The showroom around him seemed to spin. "What do you mean they revoked the license? We own that software." "No, Richard, we don't," Thomas yelled, his panic finally breaking through. "Apex owns it, and that's not the worst part. Apex also holds the leases on the entire trucking fleet. They just sent a cease and desist to all 300 of our drivers, legally ordering them to park the trucks and surrender the keys to Apex-appointed receivers. We can't move a single piece of freight. Our major clients, Target, Amazon, Walmart, are already calling, screaming about missed deliveries." "Fix it," Richard roared. "Call the lawyers. Call Gable." "Gable can't help us. I just got off the phone with him. He said you signed over unconditional control of Apex during the divorce." "Richard, Maggie didn't just take a dormant company. She took the actual engine of Sullivan Freight. Without Apex, this company is just an empty office building and a logo." Richard felt his knees go weak. He slumped against the wall of the dealership. "And Richard," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "the audit. Maggie's lawyers filed proof with the court that you used Sullivan Freight accounts, money that was legally owed to Apex for software licensing, to buy your new penthouse and fund your personal trips. Because Apex is now completely independent from Sullivan Freight, she is legally pursuing you for grand larceny and embezzlement. The board of directors is convening an emergency meeting in 20 minutes. They're going to vote to remove you as CEO to protect themselves from the fallout. The line went dead. Richard stood frozen, staring blankly at the silver Ferrari. The magnitude of what had just happened crashed over him like a tidal wave. For 20 years, Maggie had let him play the king. She had let him stand on the balcony and survey his kingdom. But she was the one who owned the castle, and with a flick of her pen, she had locked the gates, raised the drawbridge, and left him starving in the dirt. Chloe walked over, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed. The sweet, adoring facade was entirely gone. "Richard, are you buying me this car or what?" Richard looked at the 24-year-old girl he had traded his life for. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and opened it. He had exactly $400 in cash. It was, at this exact moment, his entire net worth. Richard Sullivan did not ride back to his Gold Coast penthouse in the chauffeur-driven Mercedes Maybach he was accustomed to. With his corporate accounts frozen and his Amex suspended, his personal driver, sensing the sudden shift in the wind, simply stopped answering his calls. Richard was forced to order a standard rideshare using the debit card linked to a minor checking account he kept for emergencies. An account that currently held exactly $3,200. He left Chloe standing on the sidewalk outside the Ferrari dealership, screaming obscenities at his retreating bumper. The ride to the Sullivan Freight and Logistics headquarters was agonizing. Richard's phone was a relentless symphony of disaster. Text messages poured in from frantic vice presidents. Automated alerts signaled a catastrophic drop in the company's stock price, and voicemails piled up from enraged investors. When the car finally pulled up to the gleaming glass tower in the Loop, Richard threw a $20 bill at the driver and sprinted for the revolving doors. He expected the lobby security guards to jump to attention, to part the sea of panicking employees for him as they always did. Instead, the head of security, a burly man named Frank, who usually greeted Richard with a deferential nod, stepped squarely in front of the turnstiles. "Step aside, Frank," Richard barked, straightening his tie, desperately trying to project authority. "I need to get to the boardroom." "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan," Frank said, his voice flat and devoid of its usual warmth. "Your key card has been deactivated. The board has instructed us not to let you past the lobby." "Are you out of your mind? My name is on the front of this damn building," Richard roared, his face turning a mottled purple. "I am the CEO." "Not as of 10 minutes ago, Richard," a voice echoed across the marble lobby. Richard whipped around. Walking toward him was Lawrence Mitchell, the billionaire chairman of the Sullivan Freight Board of Directors. Lawrence was flanked by two stern-looking corporate attorneys. "Lawrence, thank God," Richard gasped, stepping forward. "You have to stop this madness. My ex-wife is throwing a tantrum. It's a domestic dispute that's spilled over. Give me 24 hours, and I'll have my lawyers squash this Apex injunction." Lawrence looked at Richard not with anger, but with the cold, clinical disgust one might reserve for a squashed insect. "There is no squashing this, Richard. Our legal team just reviewed the documents. Maggie isn't throwing a tantrum. She executed a flawless corporate decapitation. Sullivan Freight doesn't own a single truck. We don't own the dispatch software. We are currently a logistics company with zero logistics capabilities." "We can sue her," Richard pleaded, panic stripping away his polished veneer. "We can tie her up in litigation for years." "With what money?" Lawrence snapped, his voice echoing in the cavernous lobby. "The board just convened an emergency vote. You are officially terminated as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, and we are joining Apex Holdings in their civil suit against you. The audit shows you diverted $7 million of company capital capital that was supposed to be paid to Apex for licensing fees to fund your midlife crisis. Richard physically stumbled backward, the breath knocked out of his lungs. "Lawrence, please. We built this together." "No, Richard. Maggie built this. You just sold the tickets. And now, the show is over." Lawrence signaled to the guards. "Escort Mr. Sullivan off the premises. If he tries to re-enter, call the police." Richard found himself standing on the crowded Chicago pavement, the midday sun beating down on him. Suddenly, a stranger to the empire he had ruled just hours before. The world was spinning. He needed to regroup. He needed his aggressive divorce attorney, Jonathan Gable. He pulled out his phone and dialed Gable's direct line. "Jonathan," Richard said breathlessly when the lawyer finally answered. "Everything is falling apart. Maggie pulled some legal voodoo with the holding company. The board just fired me. I need you to file an emergency counter-injunction to unfreeze my personal assets right now." There was a long, heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Richard, I just spent the last hour reviewing the filings from Simon Hayes, Margaret's attorney. I told you during the mediation, I am a family law attorney. I handle divorces. What your ex-wife has just initiated is a multi-jurisdictional corporate fraud lawsuit. Then recommend someone who handles that, and unfreeze my damn money so I can pay them." "Richard, listen to me very carefully," Gable said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. "Your money isn't frozen because of a simple dispute. It's frozen because Margaret's team provided the judge with irrefutable, undeniable proof that the funds in your personal accounts were commingled with embezzled corporate capital. The FBI's white-collar crime division has already been notified. I cannot represent you. Nobody at my firm can represent you. You don't need a divorce lawyer, Richard. You need a criminal defense attorney. And frankly, you can't afford a good one right now." Gable hung up. A cold sweat broke out across Richard's forehead. "The FBI? Criminal defense?" This couldn't be happening. He was Richard Sullivan. He had dinners with the mayor. He played golf with senators. He didn't go to prison. Desperate for a sanctuary, he hailed another cab and headed back to the Gold Coast penthouse. He needed silence. He needed to think. He needed to look at Chloe, his beautiful, youthful prize, and remind himself that he still had something to fight for. He unlocked the heavy mahogany door of the penthouse and walked into chaos. The sprawling, $4 million apartment looked as though it had been ransacked. Designer clothes were strewn across the imported Italian leather sofas. Drawers were yanked open in the custom kitchen. "Chloe!" Richard called out, a knot tightening in his stomach. He found her in the master bedroom. She was furiously stuffing a pair of red-soled Louboutin heels into a massive Louis Vuitton trunk. 3 other designer suitcases were already packed and zipped near the door. "Chloe, what are you doing?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. She didn't even look up. "What does it look like, Richard? I'm leaving." "Leaving? Now?" "Chloe, baby, I know today was stressful with the car, but it's just a temporary cash flow issue. My ex-wife is playing dirty tricks, but I'll get it sorted out. I just need a few days." Chloe finally stopped packing. She turned to look at him, and Richard was chilled by the absolute lack of warmth in her eyes. The adoring, sweet girl who hung on his every word was completely gone. In her place stood a cold, calculating opportunist who had just realized the gold mine had caved in. A cash flow issue. She laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Richard, I have friends who work at Chase Bank. My phone has been blowing up for an hour. You aren't having a cash flow issue. You are broke. You got fired, and you're probably going to federal prison." "That's a lie!" Richard shouted, stepping toward her. "I'm a millionaire. I'll get my money back." "You don't have any money," Chloe screamed back, slamming the lid of her trunk shut. "Everything in this apartment was bought with stolen money, which means the feds are going to seize it. I am not sticking around to get my bags confiscated by the IRS, and I am certainly not spending my 20s visiting an old man through a plexiglass window." Richard stared at her, feeling a profound, agonizing humiliation wash over him. "I left my wife for you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I gave you everything." Chloe hoisted her purse onto her shoulder. "No, Richard, you left your wife for your ego, and you gave me her money. Now step aside." As she pushed past him, Richard's eyes darted to her wrist. Snug against her skin was his vintage Rolex Daytona, a watch worth over $60,000. "Take off the watch, Chloe," he said, his tone suddenly dark. "It was a gift," she shot back, not breaking stride. "I said take it off." "Try and stop me, and I'll call the police and tell them you assaulted me," she threatened, her hand hovering over her phone. "Let's see how the judge handling your fraud case likes a domestic violence charge on top of it." Richard froze, utterly defeated. He watched in silence as the 24-year-old girl he had detonated his life for wheeled her luggage out the front door, the heavy lock clicking definitively behind her. He was alone, in a penthouse he didn't own, with no job, no wife, no girlfriend, and an FBI investigation looming over his head. While Richard was suffocating in the ruins of his own making, Margaret Sullivan was sitting in the sunlit conservatory of her Winnetka estate, calmly sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea. Across from her sat Simon Hayes, her unassuming but lethal attorney. Spread across the glass coffee table were the latest financial printouts from Apex Holdings. "The execution was flawless, Margaret," Simon said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Sullivan Freight and Logistics is officially in free fall. Their stock price has dropped 82% since the opening bell. The board ousted Richard 2 hours ago, just as we predicted." Maggie set her teacup down, her face serene. She didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. She didn't feel the burning high of revenge. She simply felt the quiet, profound satisfaction of a mathematician who had just balanced an incredibly complex equation. "What is the status of the fleet?" Maggie asked. "All 300 drivers received their notices this morning," Simon replied, tapping his pen against a legal pad. "They parked the rigs exactly where we instructed. But as you anticipated, the major retail clients, Target, Amazon, Home Depot, are in a complete panic. They have millions of dollars of freight sitting idle in distribution centers." Maggie smiled, a small, sharp movement. "Then it's time to offer them a lifeline." This was the true brilliance of Maggie's plan. She hadn't just destroyed Richard's company to be petty. She was a businesswoman, first and foremost. By severing Sullivan Freight's access to the trucks and the software, she had created a massive vacuum in the Midwest supply chain. A vacuum that only she could fill. "Have the Apex operations team send out the pre-drafted contracts to the vendors," Maggie instructed. "We will offer them a direct logistics partnership with Apex Holdings. Same drivers, same proprietary routing software, same delivery schedules. The only difference is they will cut their checks to Apex instead of Sullivan Freight. Offer them a 5% discount on their current rates for the inconvenience." Simon chuckled. "It's brilliant. You're effectively absorbing Sullivan Freight's entire client base overnight, completely legally, because you control the infrastructure." "Richard always thought the clients loved him," Maggie said quietly, looking out over her manicured gardens. "He thought his handshakes and expensive dinners kept them around, but Amazon doesn't care about a steak dinner, Simon. They care about efficiency. They care about the software I built. Without it, Richard was just a man in a suit selling air." 3 days later, the reality of Maggie's ruthless efficiency became the talk of the Chicago business world. Apex Holdings, formerly a ghost entity, emerged as a massive logistical powerhouse. They absorbed 90% of Sullivan Freight's clients in less than 72 hours. The drivers, happy to keep their jobs and drawn by the promise of better health benefits under the new Apex management structure, smoothly transitioned to the new company. Sullivan Freight and Logistics, meanwhile, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The once mighty empire was reduced to an empty glass tower and a mountain of debt. For Richard, those 3 days were a descent into a living hell. Unable to pay the exorbitant maintenance fees or the property taxes on the Gold Coast penthouse, and terrified of the impending asset seizure by federal authorities, Richard packed 2 suitcases of clothes and fled. He ended up in a grim, fluorescent-lit motel room near O'Hare Airport, paying by the week with the dwindling cash he had pulled from his emergency checking account. He spent his days frantically calling old friends, business associates, and politicians he had donated to, begging for a loan or a favor. None of them returned his calls. In the cutthroat ecosystem of Chicago corporate politics, a man under federal investigation for embezzlement was radioactive. By the end of the week, driven mad by isolation and the crumbling of his reality, Richard did the only thing he had left. He called an Uber and rode to the Vinetka estate. When he arrived, the iron security gates were closed. He buzzed the intercom, standing in the drizzling rain. "Yes," came the crisp, professional voice of Maggie's housekeeper. "It's Richard. I need to speak with my wife. Maggie. I need to speak with Maggie." There was a long pause. A minute later, the heavy iron gates slowly swung open. Richard walked up the long, winding driveway, his expensive Italian leather shoes soaking through in the puddles. He felt a flicker of desperate hope. She had let him in. Maybe she was finally ready to negotiate. Maybe she had punished him enough and was willing to call off the legal hounds. Maggie was waiting for him on the covered wraparound porch. She was dressed impeccably in a cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. She looked younger, lighter, and more vibrant than she had in years. Richard, by contrast, looked like a corpse. He hadn't shaved in days. His eyes were bloodshot, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of his ruin. "Maggie," he breathed, stepping onto the porch. He reached out as if to take her hands, but the absolute ice in her eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. "You have exactly 5 minutes, Richard," she said, her voice perfectly level, "before my security detail removes you for trespassing." "Maggie, please." "You've won," Richard choked out, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "You took the company. You took the clients. I have nothing. I'm living in a motel, Maggie. A motel." "I know," Maggie replied simply. "I own the motel. I bought the parent company that manages it 2 days ago." Richard stared at her, horrified. "Why are you doing this? I know I hurt you. I know I was a fool to leave you for Chloe. It was a mistake, a stupid midlife crisis, but you're destroying my life. The feds are looking at me for embezzlement." Maggie took a slow step forward, invading his space, her presence suddenly overwhelming. "You destroyed your own life, Richard," she said softly, but her words cut like a scalpel. "You didn't just leave me for a younger woman. That is a cliché I could have survived with my dignity intact. You humiliated me. You used the money I earned from the company I built to fund your pathetic fantasy life. You thought I was too stupid or too old to notice." "I never thought you were stupid. You thought I was blind," she snapped, her voice finally rising, echoing against the stone pillars of the house. "You thought because you were the one giving the speeches, you were the one holding the power. But I let you hold that power, Richard. I let you play the king because it made you happy. And the moment you decided I was disposable, I simply took my power back." Richard fell to his knees on the wooden porch, the great titan of industry, sobbing like a broken child. "Please, Maggie, tell the lawyers to drop the criminal charges. I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't let me go to prison. I won't survive it." Maggie looked down at him, her expression entirely devoid of pity. "I can't drop the charges, Richard, because it's not just a civil suit anymore. The IRS has officially launched a criminal probe. You used corporate funds to buy that penthouse under a fraudulent tax code. You committed felony tax evasion." She turned her back to him and walked toward the heavy oak front door. "Oh, and Richard?" She paused, her hand on the brass handle. "You should probably know. Sullivan Freight's assets are being liquidated in bankruptcy court next week. Apex Holdings put in a bid to buy the brand name and the physical tower. We're getting it for pennies on the dollar." Richard looked up, his face pale. "You're buying the shell?" "Yes," Maggie said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "I'm going to repaint the lobby, remove your name from the building, and lease it out to a tech startup. In a year, no one in Chicago will even remember you existed." "Goodbye, Richard." She stepped inside and shut the door, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a definitive metallic thud. Outside in the rain, Richard Sullivan remained on his knees, finally realizing the horrifying truth. He hadn't just lost his wealth. He had lost his legacy, his freedom, and his future. And he had handed the executioner the axe himself. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but when they finally catch, they pulverize everything in their path. For Richard Sullivan, the final crushing blow didn't come in a sleek corporate boardroom or a high-end divorce mediation. It came at 6:15 a.m. on a frigid Thursday morning, accompanied by the splintering crack of a motel room door being kicked off its hinges. Richard was asleep on a sagging mattress that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and mildew, when 5 agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, flanked by 2 FBI agents in tactical gear, swarmed the cramped room. "Richard Sullivan, federal agents, hands where we can see them!" The former titan of Chicago logistics was dragged out of bed in nothing but a pair of faded boxer shorts. His hands were shoved violently behind his back, the cold steel of handcuffs biting into his wrists. He was read his Miranda rights not by a deferential subordinate, but by Special Agent Philip T. Carmichael, a hardened, humorless veteran of white-collar crime task forces who looked at Richard with absolute disdain. "You're making a mistake," Richard stammered, his voice cracking as he shivered in the freezing draft coming through the broken door. "I'm a businessman. This is a misunderstanding over licensing fees." Agent Carmichael pulled a thick, sealed manila envelope from his jacket and tapped it against Richard's chest. "We don't do morning wake-up calls for misunderstandings, Mr. Sullivan. You're being indicted on 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of tax evasion, and 1 massive count of corporate embezzlement." The grand jury returned the indictment yesterday afternoon. Richard was permitted to put on a pair of sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt before he was perp-walked out of the dingy motel. The humiliation was absolute. A local freelance photographer, tipped off by an anonymous source, perhaps someone in Simon Hayes's office, was standing by the police cruisers, snapping rapid-fire photos. The flashing bulbs blinded Richard. By noon, the image of the once immaculate CEO, unshaven, disheveled, and handcuffed, would be plastered across the digital front page of the Chicago Tribune under the headline, "Sullivan's Fall, Freight Tycoon Arrested in $7 million. Fraud Sweep." At his arraignment hearing at the Dirksen Federal Building, Richard finally understood the true depth of his poverty. He stood before the magistrate judge, Honorable William H. Kincaid, represented not by a $500 an hour shark, but by a desperately overworked federal public defender named Samantha V. Reed. Samantha was 28 years old, carrying a frayed briefcase and completely unimpressed by Richard's former status. During their brief 10-minute consultation in the holding cell, Richard had tried to leverage his past glory. "You need to file an injunction," he demanded, pacing the concrete floor. "Get a change of venue. Call my old board of directors to testify to my character." Samantha didn't even look up from her legal pad. "Mr. Sullivan, let me stop you right there. I have 74 active cases. My last client stabbed a man over a pack of Newport cigarettes. You stole $7 million, failed to pay taxes on it, and bought a luxury penthouse. The Assistant United States Attorney handling your case is Mitchell R. Davies. He has a 98% conviction rate, and he has a paper trail provided by your ex-wife that is so airtight it squeaks. You have no leverage. You have no money. We are pleading not guilty today, merely as a procedural formality, but you need to prepare yourself for a plea deal that involves mandatory federal prison time." Richard felt the last crumbling pillars of his sanity give way. "Prison? I can't go to prison. I'm Richard Sullivan." "Not in this courtroom, you aren't," Samantha replied flatly. "In this courtroom, you're just defendant number 41802. While Richard sat in the Metropolitan Correctional Center awaiting his bail hearing, which he ultimately failed to post, lacking the required $200,000 cash bond, the federal government began its ruthless process of asset forfeiture. The Gold Coast penthouse, the monument to Richard's ego and Chloe's greed, was seized and auctioned off to a tech billionaire from Seattle. The silver Ferrari Roma was repossessed before it even had a license plate attached to it. And then there was Chloe. Chloe had fled Chicago the morning of Richard's downfall, flying first class to Miami on a ticket she bought with the last functional credit card she had. She assumed she had escaped the wreckage. She rented a lavish Airbnb in Brickell, intending to lay low and find a new, wealthy benefactor. 3 weeks into her Miami escape, funds running dangerously low, she walked into a high-end pawn shop owned by a man named Howard T. Simmons, intending to sell the $60,000 Rolex Daytona Richard had given her. She placed the heavy gold watch on the velvet counter with a confident smile. "It's an authentic Daytona," she purred. "Barely worn. I'm looking for $40,000 cash." Howard examined the watch through his jeweler's loop, checked the serial number against an international database, and frowned. He quietly excused himself to the back room. 10 minutes later, Chloe wasn't handed a stack of crisp $100 bills. Instead, 2 undercover IRS agents walked through the front door of the pawn shop. Because the watch was purchased using embezzled corporate funds, it was considered stolen property under federal forfeiture laws. Chloe was not only stripped of the Rolex, but the agents also confiscated her designer luggage, her Cartier bracelet, and the diamond earrings Richard had bought her in Aspen. She was left standing on the sweltering Miami pavement, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burner phone, learning the hard way that stolen gold turns to lead the moment the law catches up. Back in Chicago, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the terrifying prospect of a 20-year sentence if he took the case to a jury trial, Richard Sullivan broke. He accepted a plea deal orchestrated by AUSA Mitchell R. Davies. In a quiet, nearly empty courtroom, Richard stood before Judge Kincaid and pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of tax evasion. When the judge asked him if he understood that he was surrendering his rights to an appeal, Richard just stared at the wooden floor and whispered, "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Kincaid looked down from the bench, his expression severe. "Mr. Sullivan, white-collar crime is often treated as a lesser offense by the public, brushed off as the cost of doing business. But what you did was not a business error. It was calculated theft driven by extraordinary arrogance. You betrayed your company, you betrayed your shareholders, and most glaringly, you betrayed the very person who built the foundation you stood upon. I sentence you to 48 months in a federal correctional institution with 3 years of supervised release to follow. And I am ordering full restitution of the $7 million, a debt that will follow you for the rest of your natural life. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down. The sound echoed like a gunshot in Richard's ears. It was the final, definitive end to his life as he knew it. 6 months later, the Chicago skyline looked the same, but the power dynamics within it had fundamentally shifted. The building that once bore the name Sullivan Freight and Logistics in massive steel letters now featured a sleek, modern, backlit logo. Apex Global Logistics. Margaret Sullivan sat at the head of a massive, custom-built conference table on the top floor. The room was flooded with natural light, the air crisp and energized. Gone were the stuffy, dark mahogany walls and leather cigar chairs Richard had favored. Maggie had gutted the executive suite, replacing it with open glass, living green walls, and a state-of-the-art digital command center. She was currently concluding a high-stakes merger with Charles T. Winston, a formidable Omaha-based freight magnate who controlled the largest fleet of refrigerated trucks in the Midwest. "Your routing algorithm is 50 years ahead of the industry, Margaret," Charles said, signing the final page of the contract and sliding it across the glass table. "I've been trying to replicate it for a decade. I still don't understand how your ex-husband almost drove this proprietary tech into bankruptcy." Maggie took the contract, her signature neat and precise. Richard didn't understand the technology, Charles. He only understood the applause it generated for him. Apex Global isn't in the business of chasing applause. We're in the business of absolute efficiency. Charles chuckled, shaking his head in admiration. "Well, you've certainly proved that. Welcome to the $1 billion club, Maggie." It was true. By absorbing Sullivan's client base, aggressively renegotiating vendor contracts, and officially licensing her algorithm to other national carriers, Maggie had propelled Apex Global into a unicorn valuation. She had become a titan in her own right, but unlike Richard, she didn't plaster her face on magazines or throw lavish, self-congratulatory galas. She established a quiet, fiercely loyal corporate culture. She promoted women to executive roles, instituted massive profit-sharing programs for the drivers, and donated millions anonymously to domestic abuse shelters across Illinois. She had excised the cancer from her life, and the body had not just healed, it had grown immensely stronger. 1,000 miles away, in the arid, unforgiving landscape of Colorado, Richard Sullivan was experiencing a very different kind of routine. He was serving his 4-year sentence at FCY Englewood, a low-security federal prison. While it lacked the barbed wire and violent gang culture of a maximum security penitentiary, it was an environment designed to strip away every ounce of a man's individuality and ego. At 5 a.m. every morning, the harsh fluorescent lights of his dormitory, a massive open room he shared with 60 other inmates, buzzed to life. Richard wore a faded, scratchy khaki uniform with his inmate number printed in stark black ink across his chest. He was assigned to the prison laundry facility. For 8 hours a day, the man who used to command a $90 million empire and wear $5,000 bespoke suits stood in a sweltering, windowless concrete room. His job was to pull wet, heavy, steaming sheets from industrial washing machines and feed them into massive, roaring dryers. His hands, once perfectly manicured, were now calloused, blistered, and permanently smelling of industrial bleach. In the beginning, Richard had tried to talk to the other inmates about his past. Sitting in the noisy, crowded cafeteria, over trays of grey meatloaf and powdered mashed potatoes, he would desperately try to cling to his former identity. "I ran the largest logistics firm in the Midwest," he would tell a former accountant doing time for embezzlement, or a disgraced doctor caught writing fraudulent prescriptions. "I owned a $4 million penthouse. I had an Amex black card. Nobody cared. In prison, a billionaire and a bankrupt fraudster wore the exact same khakis and ate the exact same terrible food. Past wealth was an irrelevant currency." Eventually, the mocking laughter and indifferent stares forced Richard into silence. He stopped talking about Sullivan Freight. He stopped talking about the Ferrari. He stopped talking altogether. One Tuesday evening, during his designated rec time, Richard sat on a metal bench in the prison courtyard, staring blankly at the high chain-link fence. Another inmate had left a 2-week-old copy of the Wall Street Journal sitting on the bench. Richard idly picked it up, flipping through the pages. He stopped cold. On page 4 of the business section, there was a feature article on the rapidly shifting landscape of American supply chains. And there, in a crisp, professionally lit photograph, was Margaret. She looked absolutely radiant, standing in front of a massive digital mapping screen in the Apex Global Headquarters. The headline read, "The Quiet Architect: How Margaret Sullivan Built a billion-dollar logistics empire from the ashes of a scandal." Richard read the article twice, his eyes scanning the paragraphs detailing Apex's record-breaking quarterly profits, the flawless execution of the Winston merger, and Margaret's reputation as one of the most brilliant strategic minds in the industry. The article briefly mentioned Richard in a single dismissive sentence near the end, referring to him only as the former, disgraced CEO who was ousted following a federal fraud conviction. A single bitter tear tracked down Richard's weathered face, dropping onto the cheap newsprint. He had spent 20 years believing he was the sun, entirely oblivious to the fact that Maggie was the gravity, keeping his entire universe from tearing itself apart. He had traded unparalleled loyalty, brilliance, and a legacy for a temporary illusion of youth and a girl who abandoned him the second the gold ran out. A loud, piercing buzzer echoed across the prison yard, signaling the end of recreation time. "All right, let's go. Back to the dorms. Move it!" a corrections officer barked, waving a heavy flashlight. Richard slowly folded the newspaper, leaving it on the cold metal bench. He stood up, his joints aching from the manual labor, and joined the long, shuffling line of men dressed in identical khaki. He lowered his head, staring at the scuffed heels of the man in front of him, and marched back into the concrete box that was his life, swallowed completely by the shadow of the empire he threw away. If this story of ultimate karma and corporate revenge kept you on the edge of your seat, you are not going to want to miss what we have coming next. True betrayal always leaves a trail, but nothing beats the satisfaction of watching a mastermind take back exactly what is rightfully theirs. Drop a comment below and let us know. Did Richard get exactly what he deserved, or was Maggie's flawless revenge too cold? Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another incredible real-life drama.